Welcome to the Fast Leader Podcast, where we uncover the leadership life hacks that help you to experience breakout performance faster and rocket to success. And now, here's your host, customer and employee engagement expert and certified emotional intelligence practitioner, Jim Rimbach.
Call Center Coach develops and unites the next generation of call center leaders. Through our e-learning and community, individuals gain knowledge and skills in the 6 core competencies that is the blueprint that develops high-performing call center leaders. Successful supervisors do not just happen. So go to callcentercoach.com to learn more about enrollment and download your copy of the Supervisor Success Path ebook now. Okay, Fast Leader Legion, today we're going to have a great conversation because we have Dan Hill on the show, and I love having conversations with Dan Hill because he really gets, into things that we need to get greater understanding of in order for us to be successful, especially in today's world. Now, Dan Hill was born in Minot, North Dakota, and mainly raised in East Dakota, which he says is more commonly called Minnesota. Dan's childhood had one major, unique, disruptive event. At age 6, the family, including his mom and sister, all moved to Italy because his dad had received an assignment from the 3M company to manage a film processing plant along the Italian Riviera. Sounds like a tough gig. Suddenly, Dan found himself in first grade in an Italian fishing village, and not knowing the language, he could only participate in the math lessons. All of his other time went to reading the body language of his classmates and teacher and trying to get the lay of the land. A year and a half later, as the family was headed to England to get a boat home to America, came a second ultimate significant event. In Amsterdam, Dan saw the paintings of Rembrandt, which spurred his interest in emotions, personalities, and expressions. It's on our faces that we reveal our feelings. Eventually, Dan would be an art history major or art history minor in college at St. Olaf College before going on to receive a PhD in English from Rutgers University. Ever since his early adventures in Europe, Dan has been an explorer, curious about learning more about most everything. Nothing remains more fascinating, however, than human nature. The third big event in Dan's life and his career came in 1998 when Dan was working at a consulting company focused on the customer experience, trying to ghostwrite a book for the company's president. And somebody, his boss at new at IBM, sent over an article about the breakthroughs in brain science and their implications for business. The underlying truth about 95% of our mental activity is subconscious, and our reactions to the world are primarily sensory and emotive, not rational. Armed with that insight, Dan decided to launch his own company, Sensory Logic, which pioneered the use of the scientific tool called facial coding to capture and quantify customers' emotional experiences. His company has gone on to work for over 50% of the world's top 100 business-to-consumer companies, and he's also applied the tool in presidential politics and pro sports. Dan's contribution to society and the business world is bringing the role of emotions front and center. Since Dan's pioneering efforts, major players like Apple, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, and Amazon have followed his lead. The Economist magazine has described the result of combining AI, that's artificial intelligence, with the automation of facial coding as the emerging facial industrial complex. Nowadays, Dan lives in alternating seasons in St. Paul, Minnesota, and Palm Desert, California, with his wife, a retired clothes designer. And when not working, you're likely to find him either on the tennis court or watching a movie for fun. Dan Hill, are you ready to help us get over the hump?
Absolutely. I look forward to this.
I do too. And I can tell you, you first took me aback when you sent me this little, as you call it, a guidebook called Emotionomics, the emotional dynamics underlying key business goals. And we're going to focus in on 2 particular aspects of this. And so you actually broke this down into orientation and context, helping people to kind of understand what this is all about. And then you talk about marketplace applications, and we're going to focus in on workplace applications. But if you can, first start with, what is emotional dynamics?
Sure. Well, we have emotions. They show most readily on our face. In fact, someone once said that the most important 36 square inches in the world is from our eyebrows to our chin, because on our face, we give away how we're feeling. Emotional dynamics is, okay, I felt this. Emotions are contagious. What is my feeling cause you to feel? What's the gap between our two feelings? What are we going to do about it? Are we emotionally literate enough to create a positive momentum going forward? Or are we going to devolve into mutual distrust and disengagement? So there are emotions, but the emotional dynamics is what's the flow? What's the momentum? What's the interchange going on between the parties? It could be a boss and their staff. It could be executives and their entire corporate culture. It can obviously be your customers, your shareholders, the government regulators. Anybody's in play potentially.
Well, and also in the bio, we talk about this whole subconscious piece, right?
Yes.
That we were not really aware. And maybe you can validate this or refute this, but I had heard once that the people who are actually in the United Nations delegation, the delegates for the UN, actually went through a lot of training in order to take that role so that they didn't, show emotions, that they became more cognitively aware of that they were doing those things because it would affect many of the things that you're talking about. What are your insights on that?
Well, first of all, good luck trying to be poker face, because the reality is the face is the only place in the body where the muscles attach right to the skin. It is quick, real-time data. We have more facial muscles than any other species on the planet because we are profoundly social beings. The brain evolved to its current size because we started moving from being nomads to being farmers and then farming communities. As our relationships deepened and we had more social contacts, the brain literally had to grow to take into account that we had to keep track of all those dynamics, all those emotional dynamics. And that's why we have the brain that we have today that we operate with. So we're very primordial in a lot of ways, but we are advanced over animals because of that social dynamic. And what was the village then is the corporate company structure today, and still navigating those relationships all the time.
Well, gosh. Okay. So we talked about the different depths of this, and even as you were talking right there, I know I want to take myself sideways and get deeper on things, but I think it'll get us potentially off topic for our audience in regards to what we're really trying to impact here. And what we're really trying to impact and affect is, quite frankly, what is a global problem, and that is, actually attracting, top talent, and then subsequently also retaining that top talent. And then if we think about all the things that we're referring to in regards to customer experience and collaborative, environments and getting, work accomplished, there's a whole lot of things that have shifted for us in the last couple of years, meaning a lot of people are remote. They don't have proximity in order to be able to do some of, the collaboration and interpretations and all of those things. And so it's gotten extremely complex. And I've seen, I think it's one of those contributing factors into why people don't feel as connected as they used to be. And they're just willing to just jump ship, and they don't feel engaged. They don't feel in tune, all of those types of things. So if we could, let's hone in a little bit about in regards to attracting that top talent.
Sure. So let's talk about the work pool, because there's some demographics here, and then there's the emotional realities that never really go away, but get sharpened by the predicaments we're in right now. So here are a couple of the trends. One is, why do we have fewer workers? Why has the war for talent got even more intense? One is the boomers are retiring. They're moving out of the workforce. Another one is immigration levels are down. The third one is literally people have died during COVID, or they have stepped out of the workplace because they had to help, with their children, because maybe the schools were closed, daycare facilities closed. A parent got long COVID and they have to deal with them. So there are all sorts of factors going on. And then you get to, yes, with COVID, you have first remote work, at least for some portion of the work population. And now probably really we're going to land on hybrid work. And so the realities of how human beings have evolved over time is that, yes, 95, actually it's probably 98% of our mental activity is not fully conscious. We are not rational beings. That is the most primary lie we tell to ourselves and each other. Everyone else in this meeting is crazy, but I'm a rational decision maker, and I review all the facts and I come to a good objective decision. There is no objective decision making. It doesn't work that way. So you do have to take into account the emotions, and then how are you going to nurture those emotions in this kind of setting? So People are going to have options, and the best workers are absolutely going to have options. And so some of this comes back to the kind of corporate culture you're going to create, because the money is not as good or as attractive as it used to be. There's a stunning statistic that just came out from the Treasury Department that at this point in their lives, relative to their boomer parents, millennials are 16% behind the accrual of wealth rate of the previous generation, 16% behind. So they, in some ways, have almost lost faith in, I'm sorry to say it, in capitalism, in the idea that they're going to have a good, prosperous life. What they have in some ways shifted to is, I want a meaningful life. I want experiences that enrich me. I want to feel connected, collaborative. I want to fulfill whatever potential I have. That makes the war for talent a lot more intense and puts a lot more throw weight back on the executives who are responsible for the overall structure, and then for the managers who are doing the actual hiring and the vetting, and then trying to retain that talent, which we're going to get into as well. But that's kind of the fulcrum or the context for why this battle is so important and so difficult.
Well, but then if we put it in, okay, so all this, we can have all this data, we can have all this theory,
Yep.
and we can talk about this, all this, unforeseen and subconscious type of activity that drives us so much. But okay, but I need to become more savvy. I need
Yes.
to, I need to, actually apply these types of things. And, even when reading your bio, when you started talking about what you went through, that's an experience that a lot of people don't get the opportunity to undertake. Also, when you start talking about the self-absorption in digital devices, I mean,
Yes.
we are we are less involved in interacting, with human beings. And to me, it just has this compounding effect. It's like, okay, how do we turn the tide?
Yeah, no, that's a great thing to bring in the self-immersion that social media has aided and abetted. So I would say, first of all, yes, my experiences are unique, but they're not unique in that it was very disruptive. And we are now in an economy that is extremely disruptive and is going to become even more disruptive. And what I had to do to survive in a setting where I didn't have the benefit of language was to read other tea leaves. Going forward, we're going to actually move to an emotion economy. Knowledge is so common, it's like potatoes. It's not caviar at this point. And you're going to have to be upskilled, reskilled. You're going to shift careers. All those things are going to go on. So let's go to the title of this program. And one of them is, what kind of emotions do we need to attract talent? And I'm going to tell you that you have to go back to the basics. There are 7 core emotions. There's only one positive. It's happiness. And happiness is not a trivial emotion, because happiness is really, in essence, about, I want to bond, I want to connect, I want to be tied to something. When I've done my studies into happiness, there are 2 essentials that, on a deeper level, beyond just, it was a great can of Coke or a nice bottle of wine or a nice meal or, office looks pretty. Those things all matter because, we are sensory beings. But if you go to the most profound level of happiness, it's driven by 2 things. We have tight connections to the people in our lives, including the work people in our lives. People leave jobs because of managers. They can come to jobs because of managers. Do I sense that I will have happiness and fulfillment as a result of coming to work for that manager? The other key driver to happiness is that I feel safe, that I'm not terrified, that I'm not ill at ease. And the manager has a real responsibility there as well. A few years ago, I published a book called Blah, 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 A Snarky Guide to Office Lingo. Why did I do the book? I was trying to find a nice way into something that horrified me, which is that the conservative estimation is that at least 25% of all bosses are bullies. That is just a stunning statistic. And why do we live with that? And when I first read the statistic, honestly, I kind of revolted and said, no, that's too high. It can't be. And then I thought back to my life before I started Sensory Logic, the steps of my career. No, lo and behold, 40% of my bosses were bullies. So I think that number is, as some people believe, actually understated. So I need to create a sense of bonding, connection, nurture it. And I have to take away the sense of a threat. and create a comfort level. Those are the most two profound things in terms of the positive emotion that you can create to attract talent. But I'm going to add in one other one. It's a neutral emotion, but I think it's really important in an economy that's driven by empathy, that's driven by innovation, that's driven by disruptions, and that's surprise. Surprise as an emotion means that, quite literally, as a facial coder, your eyes go wider, your mouth drops open. It's as if nature is saying to you, shut up and pay attention. Look around you, take in things. That's why the eyes go wider. That's why the eyebrows rise. You're literally increasing your field of vision. What is happening here? Because anytime you have a change in the status quo, it is either an opportunity or a threat, because you're going to have to adapt to that, and you're going to have to find a way to move forward. So in the case of a worker, they should be, if you want to attract them, you should be saying to yourself, what's the path here? What's the opportunity where they're going to build their resume, going to build their connections? They're going to make themselves safer, but more connected in the immediate moment, because they've got a richer understanding of the world and things have grown for them. So they've taken the change, the surprise, and they've built on it in a nice sort of way. What that means for the person who's hiring, because it's a symbiotic relationship, is that they should be looking for someone who's open to experience. My favorite question you would ask somebody in an interview, I think, should be, what's your ROM? What's your return on mistakes? Because we have all made mistakes in life. Regret, I have, I know Daniel Pink has endorsed a few of my books. His newest book is on the power of regret. It's a real common emotion because it stays with us. We think about those missteps and what were the problems and what were the stakes involved. But the real key then is, do I dwell on it in a positive way, and I ponder and learn from it? And you want, I think, the kind of worker who has pondered that. They do have a return on mistakes. Their ROM is high, and they feel like they're going to come work for a boss who has also learned, who is growing themselves. Because someone who's growing is a sympathetic person who's making the same parallel journey. What you don't want is the boss who feels stuck in the mud. And there are too many of those. And I'm even leaving that aside from the bullies.
Okay. So I want to go back to something you said in regards to the research in regards to happiness. And so for me,
Sure.
What I have found when I did my research, and of course, there's all kinds of different sources on this, right? And there's also, let's be clear, there's a difference between motivation and human motivation. We hear about, intrinsic, extrinsic. We hear about that's different than happiness. And what I have found in my research is that happiness really comes from when the situations when we are helping others. It's the actual serving and helping others that brings us more happiness, more so than us being self-serving. And so tell me what your thoughts are in regards to what you have found in regards to, actually helping others. And that's where our long-term happiness comes from.
No, I love your instincts and I love the question. So John List is a behavioral economist at the University of Chicago. He's the chief economist for Walmart. And I said to him, okay, we got all these behavioral economic principles. And I said, they're great, but what are the essential ones? And so we had a bit of discussion / debate. And I want to cover, because I think it ties back to your question into happiness. And two of them really had to do about your learning mode. One was, how do you frame things? And you suffer from confirmation bias, which means you think all your decisions are correct. So there is no ROM because you're not even admitting that you've made a mistake. So that's already, a big issue by itself. But the other two that I want to address is, one is loss aversion, that we feel losses twice as much as we feel gains. So that goes back to that thing I was circling around on security and safety, because when we have a loss or feel threatened or something, it really gets through to us. I said 7 core emotions, 5 are negative, 1's positive, surprise is a neutral. That tells you how human nature is wired. We are looking for survival. And so we hear the bad news more loudly. And so that's one key thing. But the other one, to your point, is John and I, he originally said he thought altruism was the other 4th most important principle. And I said, I'd love to agree with you, but I've been on the planet too long. And there's just too many people where I couldn't possibly say altruism was a big driver for them. I said, how about inequality aversion? The fact that we hate it when something's not fair or just, and we're going to blow the whole thing up rather than accept it. And he said, well, that's too negative on the other hand. And I said, well, I agree with you. I said, in my darkest moments, that's where I feel like the economy and society is headed. So what we agreed on was reciprocity. And I think that's what you're talking about. And we agreed then that was the other really key thing. We do want to feel bigger than ourselves. We want to connect to something that's bigger than ourselves. We want a purpose, a meaning. We want companies that have a mission to them. And I don't mean the usual boilerplate, this is our value statement, and it's, in the lobby of the company headquarters. No, nobody looks at that. Nobody gave any input to that. It's as sterile as can be, and has all the usual suspects. I mean that companies, and one of the reasons you might be able to attract talent is they're going to feel happiness because the company has a mission, that it's donating money, that it's partnered with nonprofits, in the community, other kinds of initiatives as well. So those things are important. So yes, I think reciprocity, connection, something bigger than yourselves, that's that bonding piece that's so important. And I am actually an optimist, and therefore I like to accentuate the positive. And I think that's the key thing. As long as you're not Pollyannish about it and think that security and fear and bad news and the fact we're wired to pay attention to it isn't a real reality as well.
Well, yeah. I guess you'd say, if you think about that on a maybe like a continuum or things along those lines, from a societal perspective, I mean, so our essentially, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking that, we're on one end of the spectrum versus another end, of the spectrum. And so right now it seems like it's on that dark side and that fear and all that stuff. So again, how do we write this? Right now you have a whole lot of changes also if we start talking about attracting top talent, right? So a lot of that has gone digital, right? Yes. You put together, if you're in the market and you're seeking, and then you're also being sought after. If you don't digitally have, keywords in the right place and all of that type of stuff, I mean, you're just going to get lost. So it's like, okay, how do we break through and say, I'm actually searching for, and then therefore finding the right talent, and then getting to the point where I can even have those conversations.
Yeah, no, the keyword, issue on the resume and so forth. I mean, that's not going to go away. I'm not going to pretend that I can change everything in the world. But here's what I think could be supplemented in the process. And it's relatively low engagement in terms of the amount of time that a manager or a hiring agent have to put in. Have a real conversation with the person. Zoom is a great vehicle for saying, okay, I just need 10 minutes with you. Let me get my initial impression, because we know that, in fact, once you sit down in person with someone, most times you come in with some preconceptions. This is the framing part. And you've made the gut level decision to hire or not hire probably within a minute and a half of the meeting. Mm-hmm. How they dress, what's the energy level, the eye contact, something you liked in the resume that you can relate to. All those sorts of things are going on. So I'm suggesting you 10x that. You give them 10 minutes in a Zoom call, and here's some things you're really looking for. Because I'm trying to look out for the company as well as for the individual and how you're going to get that talent. So one thing I would go to from an emotional point of view is engagement. Are they emotionally alive? Are they, in other words, not a dead fish? This is why it matters. You want motivated employees, and people want to come work at places where they're around other motivated people who can be winners and resources and enjoyable to be interacting with, not a bunch of disaffected, cynical sad sacks who can't wait for 5 o'clock. I mean, that's kind of the poison environment that once you recognize it, you're going to be out of there if you have talent in a different orientation. So this is why engagement matters. Motivation and emotion have the same root word in Latin: to move, to make something happen. So if I was in my company interviewing someone, or if I'm looking at other things, looking at presidential candidates, looking at draft pick choices for sports teams, first thing I started with is, what's the energy level? Do they care? Is somebody home? We have 44 sets of muscles in the face that signal these 7 emotions. Are they moving? If they're not moving, I don't want to stand around as a manager and put gas in the tank every day for them. I want them to put the gas in the tank themselves, or at least meet me halfway. So that's a really important place to start. Then I do like the smile, because in that 10 minutes on the Zoom call, if they don't smile, I've got to worry a bit, because a smile is kind of nature's way of hanging a neon welcome open for business sign. It means that I will move towards you. I will accept things. I'll be open-minded. Happy people brainstorm to superior solutions more quickly. Wouldn't that be a nice thing to hire? Wouldn't you like to have colleagues who have that aptitude? Wouldn't you like to think about the fact that happiness and openness to experience, which Thomas Jefferson, our smartest president, had in, oodles of, those all things correlate. So the emotion, because we have to talk about the emotions you also want to not get to. The really strange thing about nature and facial expressions is that a smirk is awfully similar to a smile. The corners of the mouth go up, and here are the differences, and here are the meanings behind that. What happens with a smirk is typically only one side of the mouth goes up. So it looks like a smile, but it sure ain't, because it also involves attention to it. Because contempt is really a combination of happiness and anger. We like the idea that we're superior to something or somebody. That gives us the happiness. The anger is we also feel like the person's not worth trusting, and we're pissed off about it. And we're going to revolt against the situation where we don't think we should be getting closer to that individual. So if trust is the emotion of business, contempt is its opposite. Don't trust you, don't believe in you, find you beneath me. If you look at the literature, contempt is the most reliable indicator that a marriage will fail. If it doesn't work for a man and wife, it probably does not work for a boss and an employee. And that same thing goes backwards. So if I've got a smirking boss, yeah, it could be on the most positive way if there's a lot of happiness with it, that they're confident, maybe even a bit cocky, but I'm going to come to work for a winner. On the other hand, it also could mean I have somebody who's condescending. And that will kill off talent. Even if you are talented, you will feel less talented, less rewarded for your talent, less emotionally valued and respected for your talent. So, because in this conversation, we have to talk about how you attract the talent. Then you have to talk about how you onboard and nurture the talent. And then you have to talk about how you don't lose the talent. So at some point here, we're transitioning, I'm sure. But in that initial 10-minute call, my God, yes, you should make that empathy and that connection as alive as you can, but you should be reading the signals of what kind of person you're dealing with. Well, because that ain't going to change.
Well, and as you're saying that, I start even thinking about, just the diversity of the workforce. Yes, like for example, there are certain societies where they don't have as much facial expression than others, and from people, if I'm having a lot of candidates from that particular, say, genealogy, I have to also, as an interviewer, be more aware of something like that. So I may not get a smile or a cracked smile from somebody, who's coming from, that type of group. So, what happens in those situations?
No, that's a very good point. Because one of the things that's, yes, the underlying physiology, which muscle movements correspond to which emotions, does not change across the world. But the display rules change, which means contextually there are differences. I have traveled to probably at this point 80 countries. I've spoken in more than 25 countries at business conferences. I have looked at, done studies in probably 35 countries. So here are the differences I've seen. And these are gross stereotypes, but at least they're a starting point. The most lovely smiles that I've seen en masse have been either in sub-Saharan Africa or India. The least amount of smiling I've seen, one is Japan. They are all packed into that, rather tight country. They also came into being as a major world power right at the point when the British were the major example of how to be a leader. And the British are famous for understatement and, stiff upper lip and all those kinds of things. So you take the geography, you take probably some of the culture attributes, and you add in the British model. And lo and behold, yes, what you get with someone in Japan is, it kind of reminds me of my favorite haiku, which goes, only problem with haiku form, just as you're about to say something, you. run out of space. In other words, Japanese don't emote a whole lot, but that doesn't mean it's not significant when it happens, and you have to kind of set the temperature bar differently. The other one that I've really seen as a difference is Eastern Europe, and particularly Russia, which I've traveled to. And as the saying goes, if you're a happy person in Russia, you're not paying attention. Because if you look around, there's all sorts of stuff to be miserable about. And you're a fool. You're a literal certified fool if you're happy in that context. There's also a history of repression. And so people just don't feel fulfilled, connected. They're wary. And so, yes, the trust levels, the happiness levels, they're all significantly down historically in that region. And it's not just my own travel and observations. It's also other brand studies on trust levels in various cultures, various economies. All of that would substantiate what I'm just telling you. So, yes, you do have to look at context. You also want to look at the particular questions. The reason why I like 10 minutes is try to have a conversation, but also come in with an agenda. You got a few questions. I already suggested what's your return on mistake, your ROM, but surely there are other ones you want to get to. You know, even like, what do you hope to accomplish in the job? How do you see transforming this job? How can you extend this job? I want someone who's in growth mode. And so I think those are some of the opportunities.
Okay, so we've done a better job. We're becoming more aware, and we are doing the things that are necessary in order to attract, some of that top talent. But then we have to retain them. And so, if you think about it from an organization perspective, if I'm oftentimes there's a whole lot of processes that goes into the hiring and the onboarding process. And so, by the time I go through all that, if I am one of those people that get the opportunity and get hired, is I get handed off to somebody else. And so now I have an immediate supervisor of some level degree. Heck, even if I'm CEO, I got to answer to my board, right? So now things can shift on me. So how do I make sure that those people who have those attributes that I'm looking for get hired, and essentially we don't suck the emotion out of them?
Sure. Well, I'm going to play the long game, and then I'm going to play the really short, immediate game. So I remember when I joined corporate ranks for the first time, two things happened. Actually three things. One is within 3 weeks, they changed my job description like almost entirely. My salary didn't go up, but my responsibilities grew substantially. That was one thing. Another thing is I figured out that they should have hired me 2 months earlier because I had some crushing deadlines that were approaching. The third thing is I got no real orientation. You show up on a Monday, everyone's busy. I'll talk to you later in the week. They don't talk to you at the end of the week because they slip out of the office on Friday afternoon, and you feel semi-stranded, and they drop some things on your desk, and you can go onto the portal and read this and that document, but nobody's really home to help you out. So here's what I actually think, because I want to be as concrete as possible for the people who are taking this in. One is I suggest you actually make the first day on the job Friday, because people aren't as busy on Friday. There are typically fewer meetings on Friday. You could actually go to lunch and meet your other colleagues, and probably most of them will show up on a Friday. I think you should have a one-page user manual, because yes, you're working for the company, but you're also working for a very specific boss who has certain tendencies. This is how they like to get information. This is how they like to have conversations. This is their personality quirks. If they are self-aware and emotionally literate and intelligent enough, hopefully they know some of those things. And why not help the person get some sense of the lay of the land in a real way, as opposed to just the company template? Another thing, wouldn't it be nice to meet, if not the CEO, him or herself, some more senior level executive who gives you, not just you, but maybe there was 3 new hires that week, and you actually get half an hour with them, and you can answer some questions and hear from them about where the company's going and the company culture and the initiatives, so you feel tied in on the bigger picture. So you've got a sense of your boss, the real near-term context. You get a sense of the bigger thing, and I think that would help. And then you need a support team. You're climbing Mount Everest, and you're being asked to be a solo hiker, up the mountainside, carrying the rope and the pylons and everything else. Wouldn't it be nice that you would have, say, 3 people? One of them's your boss, and 2 other people, however they're selected within the department, maybe from the teams that you're about to be thrown on. And for the first, I'll say 3 months, every other week, you allot an hour where you can say, what don't you know? What you need to learn, what we're seeing so far, what you're seeing, where are the gaps, the opportunities, the misinformation. And I say that because a lot of hires, they wilt really quickly. The talent realizes or senses or believes wrongly or rightly that it's not a fit, or they're disappointed by something, or they're stressed by something, and there's no real team there to help them out. And yet we know we're moving to a more collaborative environment. Why don't we start it right in the hiring process up front?
Okay. So as again, we talk about idealism and, theoretical, and we plan and do this, but somebody who was saying in regards to the current workforce and the way that is for this particular type of job, and they do give people the flexibility to either work from home or work from the office, is that on that Friday, only 7% of people actually go into the office. So we have this dispersion. We also have, multi-geographical locations, which some could be, the person out in Minot, right? That can all happen. So how do you create that, sense of connection?
No, I like that question a lot. So here's where I think we're really moving to. First of all, let's admit that there's a class bias here. White collar jobs could work remotely. Blue collar jobs generally could not. So there's a good portion of the economy that still had to show up. They were deemed an essential worker. They were vulnerable to COVID, and all those things happened. And so they're still in place. Now, you and I are fortunate enough, we're kind of more part of the knowledge economy, and there was opportunities to work remotely, and people seized them for all sorts of reasons, including, personal safety. Where I think we're going to move to is we're never going to get back the office we had. I just don't see that happening. I do see you're going to have hybrid opportunities. And I think to really nurture collaboration and company culture and some things, you're going to have to make some adjustments. One is just occasionally, strategically, you do, to the extent it's possible, try to get together. And I say that, for instance, I got a nephew who works for the Mayo Clinic. And yeah, they've only gotten together twice. They've gotten together primarily because of social occasions and trying to bond and meet the hires and kind of integrate and so on. So there was a little bit of work, but mostly there was pizza and conversation and getting to know people. And I think that can be somewhat valid. But I'm going to argue there's at least two other reasons why you might have a meeting, and it includes this new hire and orientation. And here's one of them. You are handed down from on high a project that has all the earmarks of being, a death train. Is a project you suspect is not going to work. Initiative, someone green-lighted, and you go, oh my God. I think if you're going to have an honest conversation, you're going to have to meet in person to unearth all the hidden wrinkles and problems of this thing, because I just think there's more trust when you're literally physically in that environment together. And there's no Zoom recording that can be played back later on or handed off to somebody. And the other one is when you're really trying to brainstorm, because that's a longer conversation. And I think the emotional juice that comes from being together can benefit from that. So those are three occasions where I think, yes, let's imagine you only come to the office once a week or twice a week. What's the criteria for doing it? I think those are the three things that I would start with. So yes, the new hire, and everything I just gave you, I tried to be cognizant of the fact that realistically, people aren't going to devote huge swatches of time to these things. That's why the one pager from the manager, they can use it every time out. They just have to create it once and hand it off. I am asking for some conversations, but they're not trying to be long-winded or this is something on your agenda forever. It's for a shorter duration. So yes, maybe that Friday is, as you said, quite rightly, half the people are joining remotely. Maybe all of them are joining remotely. Maybe it's just a Zoom call, but at least, let's introduce the person. Let's have a little bit of who are you? What are your experiences here? Just anything that creates a human warmth spark. And I think it's worth something, because, payroll is your biggest expense in almost every company. And yet, if you look at executives, and there's not an equal survey for managers that I know of, but it's probably out there, but I haven't found it yet. Harvard Business Review went through and they surveyed, I think 3,000 CEOs participated. They found, to my shock, that over 50% of their time was spent either alone or just one or two, three other people, really a tight circle. That is so different than Jack Welch, who spent more than half his time on personnel matters. He was seeing who was hired, evaluating personnel. He was talking to people in the pit in Groton. He was doing, Q&As, town hall meetings. He was pressing the flesh. Yes, you might do it virtually now, but I think so much more time should be devoted to energizing and cultivating and nurturing the talent to make it happen.
Well, as you described that right there, that issue is what often creates what often people will call that glass ceiling, meaning I can't get to that next level, because what happens in an organization of any type is we gain technical skill and we start advancing because of that technical skill. But then when we get to a certain point, it has to flip and we have to have the people skill in order to be able to help do what you're talking about, guide and lead the organization versus, tactically executing with policies and procedures. And that's not that, and that's becoming more difficult. So talking about the whole leadership crisis, and when you actually go on and talking about, surveying, gathering information from chief, learning officers and human resource officers and organizations, they state as little as 19% of their workforce is even capable of taking a leader role.
Yeah, I'm not surprised, unfortunately. My father was an executive at 3M, and I've interacted with a lot of leaders over time, and they can be very smart and very motivated people. They can also have a real gap. There's a CEO who was quoted as saying, "I don't do feelings. I leave that to Barry Manilow." What an incredible statement. Because guess what? There are only two currencies in life, dollars and emotions. We have feelings. They drive outcomes. You don't have any choice to say, "I don't do feelings." Of course, you did a feeling right by making that statement. You showed contempt, condescension. I'm well aware, and in fact, it's in that book, Blah, 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 Snarky Guide to Office Lingo, where someone who works in HR said, here's the real definition of HR as far as executives are concerned. They call it the tissue lady. They've assigned emotions to women, and they assume they're negative and poo, sorry me, and so forth, and they don't take it seriously. When I talked about regret and return on investment, I'm taking sadness seriously. That you actually, because one of the advantages of sadness is it slows you down and it makes you ponder, like what went on there? Why do I feel this disappointment, this loss? Why do I feel disconnected from other people? Why have I abandoned hope? Those are important things to realize. Now, I'm not suggesting you dwell on it or you indulge in it, but it's a valid emotion and you should be able to go there. And so to call HR the tissue lady is terribly and deeply revealing about the fact that 19% of leaders, it's only that amount, I believe, because they're also not good at being emotionally literate. I used to do this at conferences for a while. So 7 emotions. I used to create a little thing where I said, here's a one-word distillation of what that emotion means. It's a matching exercise. I wouldn't even give you, some bogus ones to throw it in and make it harder. Just match them up, this 7 to these 7. The average when I did that in conferences, 3 out of 7 correct. So emotional literacy is a long way from being real. Can you imagine you'd hire executives who don't know the difference between a $1 bill and a $100 bill? No. How can you not know the difference between anger and fear, and then also how they're actually interrelated to one another? These are all important matters.
Well, as you're talking, so you mentioned emotional literacy. We're talking about emotional dynamics, but here it kind of rang into my head where I'm like, really, aren't we talking about emotional finance?
We are in a way, yes. And we're certainly talking about morale, and we're talking about retention, because if I find myself dwelling in the land of sadness and contempt, any reasonable human being will say, I'm miserable. I'm getting out of here. I signed on for pleasant surprises and happiness. I wanted wows and I have Uggs. instead. That doesn't work for people. I mean,
No.
the people who will tolerate that are the people who can't generate any other options or have sunk so deep into the swamp that they're just going to live in the swamp. And that's going to make them, their bosses, and their colleagues all miserable.
Well, and it's what you're left with, right? And then so you can bring in somebody to try to change that tide, but then they're just going to say, "Oh, no, I'm out of here."
Yeah, no, it's a real risk. I mean, a friend of mine said there's a lot of until workers, by which he means until lunch, until 5:00, until the next job, until I retire. You don't want until workers. That is not a great thing for anybody involved. And we have this life. I truly believe you try to make the most of it you can, and therefore you also try to make the company you're at the most that it can be. That's why I truly think that what I've invested in terms of this being my mission is significant to making America strong and its economy strong and fulfilling people on an individual level. That's why I have the passion to do what I do.
Well, and one of the things that we're hearing more and more about is this quiet quitting thing.
Yes.
Okay. So is quiet quitting essentially a phrase that we're using to really address the issues that you and I have been talking about?
We are, because when you look at the surveys on engagement, boy, they're woeful. Typically, it'll vary by country and occupation, but really fully engaged, you're usually looking at numbers like 18% or 27%. I mean, what person who had a factory and said, "Oh, the factory's running at 15% output capacity," would be satisfied with that? You'd be fired the next day if you're the person running that processing plant. How can you be a boss and you have that kind of level underneath you? I mean, it should be totally intolerable. I mean, the same thing is true for two other key statistics. If you ask even CEOs about do they think they have the company culture they should have and do they have the level of innovation they should have within the company, they will, in their most honest moments, give you numbers like on innovation as low as 6% and on company culture like 15 to 25%. I've rarely seen anything above 35%. So these are all woeful numbers. And so, yes, early on, you asked me to describe emotional dynamics. They feed right into the profit model because, this all's got to work together.
Okay. Also, too, I'm starting to get a very clear picture that in order for a leader to be more effective, one of the things that we have to gain skill on is helping people with stress management.
Yes. Yeah. People burn out. People are extremely fragile. So there's something called the Big Five factor. It's the 5 leading traits. And everyone knows Myers-Briggs and so on. Myers-Briggs is discounted by anyone who's in the know because it leaves out one really important trait, which is neuroticism. The fact that human beings lack emotional stability. It accounts for about 40% of human nature. 40%. To put it a different way, supposedly Napoleon, in retreating from Russia, said mud is the 5th element, along with wind and air and fire and so forth. There's a lot of mud out there. There's a lot of emotional instability. There's a lot of fragility. People can get punctured readily. That's why bringing a relationship at work to contempt is hard to recover from, because it's very toxic. It means I've essentially formed a judgment about the other party. And we don't tend to like to go back on our judgments. It's harder to drive a car in reverse than to go forward. So we tend to stick with that judgment. And it's really a toxic one, and it's hard to recover or reestablish momentum from. You can get yourself the car moving out of sadness, but you can't get it out of contempt very readily. And yet we really have to try to avoid ever getting there and trying to build a more nurturing relationship. So let me give you some ways, if you don't mind. So let's jump to the executive level for just a moment. Fulfillment comes from, in part, feeling like I matter, my voice matters, my input matters. Wouldn't it be lovely? This is one of my favorite pet projects at the moment, or ideas. When you have an executive hire, the truth of the matter is that person and their capability matters to the entire organization and everyone's livelihood. If you're spending that kind of bucks and that kind of level of responsibility, do I really want to just leave it to an insider group of the headhunter and the executive team and maybe the board of directors? why not throw it open to have a voice? I mean, yes, they can curate and decide these are our top 3 candidates or top 2 candidates. I would love a pair of town hall meetings that can be done remotely. You can save the recordings so people can go back to within the next few days. Everyone gets to pose questions anonymously or not, their choice, and see how the person handles it on their feet. Who's home? How lively are they? Are they an empty suit? Do they have a heart? Do they have a brain? Do they have passion? What's their level of spontaneity and warmth? And then let the people vote on who they think should come into the company. Wouldn't that be an amazing transformation? What about the board of directors? There's no employee representative. We all know that in companies, there are informal leaders. They don't show up on the org chart, but they're there. And you need them during mergers and acquisitions and reorgs. And I think you should have them on the board of directors. Even if they're not in all the meeting or they don't get all the documents, but at least hear their voice, unfiltered, direct, not trampled down and suppressed based on the food chain. My father at 3M said, and he eventually ran 3M's printed post-it note operation, production, sales, and marketing. So he had one of the real drivers of income for 3M company. It was a very stressful job, even though it was exciting. And he said to me, this is what happened, Dan. The higher I got up in the food chain, the more important were the decisions I had to make, and the more whitewashed was the data by which I was supposed to make those decisions. No one wanted to share bad news or concerns. They just passed it up the food chain. We need more input. We need more democracy in the workplace. Nucor does this. They have a lot of interaction between executives and work teams. They visit the plants. They have compensation based on how much input they're getting and innovation ideas. If you don't have that from your team, then the manager promotional track is not as attractive, as successful. It's a pretty good model, and Nucor, relative to its competitors, does better, more profitable over time. So democracy and profitability are not enemies. They don't have to be. And there's a real life example for it. When I was at a major utility, I worked directly for the CEO. I produced one of the top annual report in the industry, 3rd best cover nationally. Chairman loved it. What happened was I also wanted to create an annual employee magazine or report, because you're going to be in the land now of supposedly not just shareholder, but stakeholder capitalism. Then the employee base should be as important as the investors. But I had a very narrow-minded VP, and he squelched the idea. But I said, we're not trying to, bring up all the simmering issues. I also want people to be celebrated for the initiatives and the ideas, hear their voices, share their experiences, create camaraderie, reduce the silos in this company. Because at a utility, we had gas and electric, and God, it was like 2 different countries. They never interacted with one another. It's a shame. But I think there's lots of opportunities to bring out more in people. There's so much that's latent there. Why accept that low engagement rate? Bring it up. It's doable. I really believe it's doable. When I did the annual employee meetings for the CEO, we totally changed the format. I got more involvement, more Q&A, more spontaneously, more speakers. We lifted the satisfaction level with the annual employee meeting by 20%. I kid you not, 20%. The chairman was ecstatic. These things are possible. It's just that, as Thoreau said, our winged thoughts are turned to poultry. We have great ideas, and then they get shot down or ignored. Let them breathe.
Yeah. And then, that's kind of what I talked about as far as we hire those people and we get them in and we suck, all that positive emotion out of them by doing all of these other things. And we need to stop that. And you talked about something as far as, a passion, a side passion, even for yourself. So when I think about the work that you have accomplished so far and are still yet to do, what is one of those things that you look at and say, this is really a goal of mine and a mark that I want to have left? What would that be?
Well, that's a wonderful question, and I've never been asked that in all my appearances on TV and podcasts. So I adore the question. Boy, I have to say that I think the energy these days is really in the employee experience. I really think it is. When I did the new version of Emotionomics 2.0, I moved branding up front, because before I had it in the marketplace, I was like, no, that's not good enough. The employees these days really care about the mission of the company. And if you're going to attract talent, retain talent, you even as a consumer, you'll just see that branding is so central to how millennials, and Gen Z look at the world. So I would love to, I guess here's my very first thing, and it caused me to write blah, blah, blah. I like to get the bullies out of there. We've all experienced bullies. I had an interview with somebody who is one of the leading experts on crime. And he said, here's the really interesting thing. We sometimes look at crime and we despair. There's so many guns out there, so much, violence. He said, when you look at the data closely, you find that there are hot spots and hot people. In other words, in any given city, most of the violence occurs in about 1% of the city blocks. I mean, it's a really tiny amount. And then you even look at the gangs, he said, and the truth is, usually 3/4 of the gang is scared to death of the other quarter of the gang. Those are the crackpots. Those are the crazies. Those are the ones with a mean streak as broad as can be. He said, you try to reform or peel away the other people in the gang, but they're intimidated themselves by these people within the gang. And those are the ones you basically throw the key away. You lock them up and you get them off the streets because there is no reforming. I can't believe that you could possibly allow for these bullies to exist and ruin your company. I mean, they might be good people in a different role, and this just doesn't suit them, to your point that they got lifted maybe because their hard skills were good and their people skills don't exist, but then find another capacity for them. Or if that's not possible, then let them go. Get them out of there. That is going to be a boon to other people. I once was asked to speak at a town hall for a company in Silicon Valley. And no executives showed up. The HR executives only showed up. And people were really honest with me, maybe because I'm an emotions expert and I actually care about these things. And there were so many tales of woe where they felt shut down, ignored, disrespected. There was so much untapped potential in that meeting and so much sorrow. It was stunning. I mean, more than a decade ago, that meeting was held, and I still think about it probably every week. So I would say that's my number one goal. My number two goal, probably coming from a 3M household, is I love innovation. I absolutely love innovation. When I did that annual report of the utility, $6 billion company, the second year I had a 2-page spread reserved for our innovations. I had to pull it. We didn't have a single innovation worth talking about. $6 billion company. I couldn't believe it. When I was a young kid and I bought my first 2 shares of 3M stock with my paper route money, I went to the annual shareholder meeting. And as you came into the meeting, and this is true with 3M to this day, you passed table after table on your way into the conference hall, which were all the latest innovations. I mean, there had to be at least 60 that were evident for us there. So I think that innovation really is going to be important. And here's one idea that I really love about innovation, actually even 2. One is there should be a customer experience day or even a couple of days. You have a shareholder meeting, you have an employee meeting. Geez, let's see, who's missing from that? Oh, that's right, we have customers. Wouldn't it be good to actually invite them in the building, let them interact with the people in the call center, interact with other people, HR, everybody who's involved, and the R&D experts who are off in some corner, maybe all have PhDs. I've got one myself, but just because you have a PhD doesn't mean you're wise. It just means sometimes you stayed in school a long time. Let them circulate, let them interact, make it more democratic. The other thing I love is an exercise where you actually take a group of people internally. They probably have to be volunteers, and they're kind of the kamikaze squad, but I mean that in the most positive way. They imagine that they're a rival company. They know all the warts and gaps within your own company. And imagine they're a in-house startup, and they're going to be your new competitor, and they're going to leverage all the opportunities that have been missed and all the sore spots that are there right now, and see what they come back with, and then learn from it, adapt from it. Better to be attacked by an internal support team than external rivals, and get a head step.
Well, the irony is you're getting attacked if you don't address it.
Of course, absolutely. You just won't notice it until suddenly your lunch has been eaten.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, and Dan Hill, we wish you the very best. All right, here we go, Fast Leader Legion. It's time for the Hump Day Hoedown. Okay, Dan, the Hump Day Hoedown is a part of our show where you give us good insights fast. So I'm going to ask you several questions, and your job is to give us robust yet rapid responses that are going to help us move onward and upward faster. Dan Hill, are you ready to hoe down?
I'm terrified, but go ahead.
All right. We'll help to manage some of your stress here. Okay. So what is holding you back from being an even better leader today?
Geez, I think I don't spend enough downtime with people. There's a lot of advantage, and it seems like it's lost time or wasted time, but it's how you're forming those little connections. So last night I went and played tennis, and then I kind of wanted to go home because my mother-in-law is seriously ill, and I wanted to check phone. So I did do that, and I did call my wife, but I also spent an extra hour and a half with the tennis players because I play with these guys and I don't know them. Because that's one of the problems that guys have sometimes. We do things together, we don't get to know each other on a more personal level. So I think that's one of my shortcomings. I'm so excited about the ideas and the potential, but you got to be absolutely front and center about who are the people who you're going to bring with you on this.
And what is the best leadership advice you have ever received?
Ooh, the best leadership advice. Ask more questions. But then actually listen to the answers. I mean, I've been in meetings where, you can see they're almost like doing it rote. Okay, I have to ask this question. I've been told to ask this question. And then ask the question behind the question. So that's that openness and inquiry. Don't think you already know the answer. I remember when I got my PhD, someone said, "Oh, your dissertation's like a monument." And I said, "No, it's more like a tombstone." What we know already isn't as valuable as what we're about to know, and realizing what we don't know.
And what would be one of your best tools that you feel helps you lead in business or life?
Well, of course, I have to choose facial coding, because if you've never been lied to in life, congratulations. So there are the lies that other people tell you, and there are lies you tell yourself. So sometimes, the most valuable thing that happens with me, facial coding, isn't just what I'm reading on other people's faces. It's when I say something and I realize they're not going there with me. They don't believe in that's going too far. That's off the mark. That doesn't matter to them. So there's either no reaction or maybe one of those god awful telltale smirks on their face or something that makes me go, oh, I got to recalibrate because I just lost my audience. I remember one time I was a college professor at the time, and I thought I had given a really great lecture. I had the student who sat in the back, not one of my best students, but really I thought a pretty smart guy, just not willing to, jump in the pool and swim with us. As he left class that very day, he just chose the day of what I thought was my best lecture all semester. He passed his hand over the top of his head and said, "Great lecture, Professor Hill." In other words, it didn't reach him at all. It didn't connect. It was over his head. I had to go home and reflect on that. And I realized the lesson plan had too much lecturing and not enough interaction. And I would have known it was over his head if I'd asked more questions.
And what would be one book you'd recommend to our Fast Leader Legion? And it can be from any genre.
Wow. I love your questions. I must say, boy. Well, I'm going to choose one that's actually about the African slave trade. This will surprise you. So the African slave trade ended because of one guy strolling down to the dock in Antwerp, because he had noticed that the boats going to Africa weren't carrying any cargo. And yet in the triangular trade, all this cargo was coming back from the US, back to the British economies. He said, how could it possibly be that you get something for nothing? That's not how the world works. And then he realized when he spent more time on the dock and started talking to people, and then actually took a boat ride down to the Congo, that it was because they were exploiting people. And, that didn't end well for anybody. And he was instrumental. He actually led the charge that England was the first country, because he was British, to enact the slave trade. And I just thought it was the most amazing book because it's the power of observation. He was curious, the puzzle didn't fit together, and he investigated. There's a wonderful thing from Sherlock Holmes, who said to Watson, you have an instinctive grasp of the obvious. We are way too given to just confirming what we think we already know. And I love that book because that guy made a real difference. He brought to end a savage practice just by an extra stroll down to the dock and going, this is really peculiar. What's going on here?
And so do you have the title of that book?
Yes, I knew you were going to ask me that, and I don't blame you. And for the world of me, I can't summon it offhand.
Okay, so what we'll do is we'll make sure that we follow up with that, and that's on your show notes page.
I will get it to you. I will get it to you.
Yep, we'll make sure that's on your show notes page. So, Fast Leader Legion, you can find links to that book as well as many other resources by going to fastleader.net/ or actually just doing a search at fastleader.net for Dan Hill. Dan has actually been on the show. This is his second interview. I just love the conversation. But Dan, we've got one more Hump Day Hoedown question.
You're a dangerous man. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so imagine you have been given the opportunity to go back to the age of 25, and you can take the knowledge and skills that you have back with you, but you can't take it all. You can only take one. So what skill or piece of knowledge would you take back with you, and why?
Patience. Actually, I wouldn't say I had a lot of patience at 25. I got my PhD in record time at Rutgers. Fastest time since they've started tracking it. I like to move through things. I told you that in an earlier answer. I need to spend more time with the people. I think you have to realize where people are coming from, and you have to accept their limitations. You don't give in to the limitations, but you recognize them. So I think that I've become more humble and more recognizing of the realities. Salman Rushdie, who of course was unfortunately just stabbed recently and survived, his most wonderful writing, I thought, was actually about The Wizard of Oz, which was a movie that he loved as a kid. And he said, the interesting thing is what happens to us in life eventually is we realize we're all the Wizard of Oz. When you pull back the curtain, you find that you yourself are on the little, cardboard stand, and you're not really the wizard. And so when you're a kid, you think adults are so stupid and so limiting. And then eventually you realize that you're in the same predicament yourself, that you have your own weaknesses and problems. And you can look at that as a negative, and I look at it as a positive. I think it means you're making more allowances, you're wiser, you're kinder, you're more accepting of the predicaments we find ourselves in. And so that's why I'm telling you it's patience.
Dan Hill, thank you for sharing your knowledge and wisdom. How does the Fast Leader Legion get in touch with you?
I love getting personal emails. I'll actually respond to them. So dhill@sensorylogic.com. We'll do the ticket if they want more background or my books. That's another way of conversing with me, so to speak. That's on my website, which is, of course, the obligatory 3 W's, and then just sensorylogic.com, like your 5 senses.
Dan Hill, man, it has been an awesome discussion, and thank you for helping us all get over the hump. Thank you for joining me on the Fast Leader Show today. For recaps, links from every show, special offers, and access to download and subscribe, if you haven't already, head on over to fastleader.net so we can help you move onward and upward faster.